China's move toward self-sufficiency, elevate the role of national security above economic policy.
Where was the turning point, and what actually made it turn to a situation that we're kind of witnessing today?
In the 1990s, the early 90s, we took all of that and thought, what a wonderful thing to capture this remarkable country. And I've often thought about this. How did China lose America?
喺睇片之前，大家記得分享、讚好同訂閱灼見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁你就唔會錯過我哋嘅最新影片。
You know, the US-China relations is, I think, without doubt in my mind, the most important bilateral relationship in the world. However, I think beyond being so important to the two countries, obviously, I think it is also a huge impact on the rest of the world. And especially for us in the private sector, in the business sector, I can tell you this is perhaps the most important thing that we take account of and must take account and really examine in everything that we do today. So I think to explore this relationship, I think we have a very distinguished panel. Charlene, perhaps we can start with you. You have actually been perhaps the person with the most history on this panel about the US-China relations. You know, your work starting from, the 1990s or even before that, and especially in my memory, Charlene's contribution to really China's entry to the WTO is a milestone event in my mind for the world. So Charlene, can you actually start off by giving us some historic perspective over the last 45 years, and especially distilling from that some of the key lessons that I think we have to keep in mind as we go forward to the next 45 years?
You know, thinking about the US-China relationship and going back in time feels like a very long time ago now. At the time, of course, in the early 90s, China had a population of 1.3 billion people, the world's largest standing army, a nuclear power, a country that was beginning to open up on the basis of extraordinary reform put in place by Deng Xiaoping, and a country that wanted to engage with the world in a way not really seen before. In the 1990s, the early 90s, we took all of that and thought, what a wonderful thing to capture this remarkable country, to capture these reforms and opening, and to bring the two countries together, to bring China, help bring China into the global community on a rules-based, market-oriented system. And so we embarked on that project. As you well know, we talked many times about it. Yes. And China made extraordinary changes to get into the WTO. And then this reform and opening expanded, deepened. Its scope became very, very broad, and the entire world benefited. There's no question that the globalization of that period brought extraordinary wealth, extraordinary decreases in global poverty, and such. And over time, it was presumed these positive trends would continue. But many things intervened along the way. 2008 financial crisis was a seminal moment, calling into question the Western model. China itself began something of a U-turn from integration toward something rather different. The US began to pull back from its classic leadership role and anchor of the international system. And many other features of the global economy began to change, putting great stress on the bilateral relationship and stress on the original decisions that were so welcoming to China. There are many things we can say about the current situation, but none, I think, more important than the two countries must find a way to get back on track. It's in the best interests of both countries, of the people of both countries, of the world, for stability, for business, and for peace.
Thank you, Charlene. You know, getting back on track, I think, is going to be an important question that all of us would discuss. You know, I, for one, have really thought that this bilateral relationship over the last 45 years has done tremendous good for the world. You know, you know, really, if you think about for America, for China, for the rest of the world, we have all benefited. What was the turning point? And what actually made it turn to maybe a situation that we're kind of witnessing today? And maybe if we can understand that and we can actually go back to think about how we might actually, using your words, put the relationship back on track. Where was the turning point? What were the factors then in your mind?
I think the factors were many. China's move toward self-sufficiency, its move to elevate the role of national security above economic policy, its move toward a more ideological basis of exchange rather than a pragmatic basis of exchange. On the US side, deep financial and other problems. The effect of the financial crisis really can't be overstated because it took 10 years for the economy to actually recover and to put people back where they were. A feeling on the part of many in the United States they never got back to where they were, and that somehow globalization and China were to blame for that. Where globalization had been a net positive, it was viewed as a net negative. Where China had been admired, it was viewed as harboring interests antithetical to those of the United States. And of course, a world situation that has become very unstable. The effect of Russia's actions in Ukraine, the Middle East, of course, the South China Sea, the East China Sea. There are many different flashpoints that have emerged into what already was becoming a more populist, nationalistic move on the part of both the United States and China. I don't know that there was any one turning point, but a confluence of all of these issues really found their home in the US-China relationship. I should add one other thing, which is, and I've often thought about this, how did China lose America? How did it lose America? And I think the difference in ambition, the difference in expectation, the move toward not just self-sufficiency, but publicly endorsing a dominance is the word used, of the technologies of the future, of the technologies of future growth, turned economic engagement and integration not into a stabilizing force, but into an absolute rivalry, an adversarial situation. The U.S., rather than embarking on a program to understand these changes, to work with China, to perhaps understand those differences of competitive and other areas, and come up with a modus vivendi, come up with a way to move toward entente, the U.S. instead started a trade war. This was entirely unproductive, the effect of which was a failure on economic grounds for the United States and the U.S. economy, and of course, only exacerbated the situation that already existed. So I don't think there was one point. I think there were many points, and I think each side believes the other was the perpetrator. Yep. And this has created this very negative dynamic, which, as I said, and you reiterated, of course, in your opening, really must stop. Because, as Henry Kissinger said, and I know we're honoring him later, the U.S. must recognize the permanence of China. China must recognize the permanence of the United States. And therefore, there is no alternative, certainly no alternative we want to contemplate, other than coexistence. So we must find a way to achieve that coexistence.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Johnny. That really puts it in perspective. You know, the way you've summarized it is the U.S.-China relations today has become, you know, really a multi-dimensional, very complex, non-zero-sum game. And I think the way, the attitude of how the two respective players actually participate in this non-zero-sum game is crucial. That we cannot really play this as a zero-sum game and downward spiral. But I really, and there are many multiple complex factors that one has to study and unwind before we can put it back on the right track, in your words. What about the future of multilateralism? How can we think about this bilateral relationship in the context of the multilateral system, not just in isolation? So maybe, and I will start with Charlene and then go, maybe you can just give a 1-minute thing on what you think about the future, the next 45 years. And Charlene, take a little more time because I'd like you to give your views on the multilateral. You're the expert here.
I think the multilateral system faces extraordinary challenge. And those challenges have been evident for at least a generation. Multilateral system is very slow. It is behind. It took 10 years for the Uruguay round of global negotiations to conclude. The Doha round of global communications has never concluded. We're approaching year 25. It took 13 years to reach a subsidies agreement on fisheries and the depletion of fishing resources. And that agreement, because that seemed controversial to many members of the WTO, was itself watered down. 13 years for half an agreement. So, and technology, of course, is a blip in the WTO. Agriculture and commodities remain the largest sectors of focus. So the system is antiquated, it is old, it is a generation behind the times, it is unwieldy, and because unanimity is required, any one country can raise its hand to say, I don't think so, not today, and the negotiations stop. Needs to be revamped. There needs to be an executive committee. There needs to be a complete rethink of how the system should work, because otherwise there is no multilateral trade forum that is usable.
I think that's tremendous, Charlene. I think as much as we have worked in the old system, we have to admit that we really need a new multilateral system. And maybe the solution to that is also a way of actually doing something about the bilateral relations and kind of put it in the context of a new multilateralism and a totally different perspective on how that bilateral relationship can develop. So how about the next 45 years for the bilateral? Just a quick thought.
I think it's impossible to say. 45 years ago, would you have thought China would be where China is today? 45 years ago, would you believe you are where you are today? So I think it's very hard to hypothesize. The only thing I would say is that for countries, if you are resilient economically, resilient in terms of security, resilient in terms of the cohesiveness of your society, then the next 45 years, the good and the bad, will wash out. But if you're not resilient, if you are divided, if you are incapable of lending security to your national aspirations and to individual aspirations, then you are in reactive mode. Then the world buffets you around, and the result is improvisational reaction, improvisational relationships, absolute instability. So for my money, the next 45 years ought to focus on resiliency.
Can't agree more. And resiliency in generational terms, and not react to the current happening here and there.
中意名家分析，記得俾 like 同埋分享，支持同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁就唔會錯過我哋嘅新片。